Well, it's a beautiful morning. I hope you're having a great one. Let's make it even better. Get your coffee. Values of a culture are demonstrated in the things that the individuals who make up that culture value. In other words, our values are seen in what we do, and how we value others is seen in how we treat them. It's also demonstrated in what we expect other people to do as well. Shortly after the church first began 2,000 years ago, as it's described in the New Testament book of Acts, we see two different cultural values collide. There in Acts chapter 6 specifically, what you have there is a new culture that's being created within the church, and you have outside cultures coming in to be a part of that church. And as those outside cultures come in to be a part of that church, that's where you have the collision of the things that those cultures value and those cultures expect. And among those who are now believers in Jesus and members of the church, they're now blending the cultures together there in this new culture within the church. And one culture that came into the church at that time, really the earliest culture that came into the church at that time, were those who came from a Hebrew Jewish culture that grew up primarily in Judea, in the land of the people of Israel. And these people highly valued honoring parents, and as a result, honoring widows. And that was directly related to the Jewish law, the law that they had grown up under there within their land, which repeatedly called upon the people of the culture of Israel to take care of the potentially oppressed minorities among them. You see this in the exhortations to the Jewish people in the Old Testament of Scripture to defend the cause of the foreigner, the widow, and the orphan. And so there was this call to the people throughout the law to defend the cause of the foreigner, the widow, and the orphan. So then another culture that came into the church to be blended together as a new culture were those who were Jewish by faith, but they were culturally Greek. They were Hellenistic Jewish Christians who were coming into the church. They had that Jewish faith, so they had a common faith that they were coming from as the Hebrew Jewish individuals who were coming to the church, but their culture was significantly different. And of course, this causes a conflict. This causes a problem because you have the values of one culture and you have the values or the lack of values of another culture, and those things collide. And you can read about it in Acts chapter 6, where we see it really demonstrated through a problem that came about in the church having to do with widows. Now, we're in 1 Timothy chapter 5 this morning, and the first half of the section deals with how the church is to deal with and take care of widows within the church. So it's not specifically dealing with what was happening in Acts chapter 6. This is many years later. The church has moved beyond the land of Israel. It's gone into the Roman world, into a predominantly Hellenistic Greco-Roman culture, where these values for those minorities, the foreigner, the widow, and the orphan, they weren't as much ingrained into the culture, but the church is seeking to continue that because these are the values of God. The values of God are demonstrated through the Hebrew law, through the Jewish law. And so God is still seeking to move these values into his church. And we see it here in this passage in 1 Timothy 5. And I don't necessarily want to talk about widows, but I do want to talk about something that we see right after Paul is speaking about widows and the way that the church ought to value them or expect others to value them. And he says this really powerful word, but if anyone does not provide for his own, and in the context, it's talking about providing for those in one's family that might be a widow, but it's a much bigger exhortation. But if anyone does not provide for his own, especially those of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Those are really powerful words, and they demonstrate the important cultural value or the cultural expectation of those who are followers of God, those who are followers of Jesus, those who are members of the church, who are Christians. It's the value and an expectation of male responsibility. That's what's clearly seen in this verse. The language is so very clear. If anyone does not provide for his own, it's masculine, especially those of his household, masculine, he has denied the faith, and he is worse than an unbeliever. And in some translations, it doesn't just say he's worse than an unbeliever, it says he's worse than an infidel. You see, not only is our culture demonstrated in what we value, but our faith, that we trust in Jesus, that we're a part of his church, we are his followers. It is demonstrated in what we value. It's demonstrated in what we do. So, male responsibility. Our modern Western American culture does not appear to expect much in the form of responsibility for men, or at least until they're much older. We've kind of shifted the time at which we expect guys to take responsibility and grow up. That they can go through their teens and through their 20s and well into their 30s and maybe even to the point that they're 40 and still not really begin to take responsibility for themselves and for others. And obviously, just in the way that we have placed very low expectations upon people within our culture, we're showing what we value. We don't highly value that. But if you're a follower of Jesus, it should be different. And this is why Paul was writing this to Timothy, who was pastoring a church in a city called Ephesus. And Ephesus was a very Greco-Roman Hellenistic world, just like the world of our day, and its philosophy and its worldview. And apparently the people of that place, just like the people of our place, did not have a high value or expectation upon those who were men in their society. And Paul's saying that should be different. It should be different for those who profess to be followers of Jesus. So if you profess to be a follower of Jesus, and especially if you're a guy, this is something to think about, that the scriptures call upon you to take responsibility for yourself and for those that are nearest to you. And if that taking responsibility for them means that you find ways to provide for them and take care of them, then that's certainly what you're called to do. This is what is in line with the values that God has. And so he calls us to be like him, to be godly in this way. Something to think about as you drink your coffee this morning. We'll see you next time.